My paper is titled The Transformation of Novels as a Conduct Manual in the 18th Century, an Analysis of Pamela and the Governess. In the 18th century, there was a social fear of the child reader reading the novel as a conduct manual. However, many critics in this paper proved that the novel informed the child reader as a conduct manual, and therefore, adults manipulated the novel and genre to indoctrinate the child reader to social ideological hierarchies. In the 18th century, the novel underwent revolutionary changes. Other critics and scholars argue that there was a social anxiety surrounding reading novels, specifically in concerns to the child reader. The ironic sociological fear was in the relatability of novels to their young readers' situations. This anxiety moves society to reconsider the use of the novel, creating a transformation to an overtly didactic novel. Sylvia Casey Marks writes in Writing for the Rising Generation, British Fiction for Young People, 1672 to 1839, that writers of the 18th century British juvenile fiction consistently underscored the traditional conduct book injunction of fulfilling one's duty. Specifically in relation to Fielding's The Governess, Marx writes, writers required a palatable way of providing examples of behavior to be followed and avoided. This paper serves as part of a larger project, analyzing the development of major works read and taught to children from the 16th through the 18th centuries. Currently, scholarship exists which explores the social critical discourse revolving around the novel of the 18th century, and there is some scholarship about the child in general. However, this paper seeks to compare the evolution of novels into social conduct manuals for children, specifically young girls, in relation to the changing genre boundaries of novel. This paper argues that one of the primary authors, Samuel Richardson, in his novel Pamela, does in fact revolutionize not only the novel's form, but, and possibly more importantly, creates a didactic novel which was read as a conduct manual for children as a result of the social anxiety surrounding the young adult novel reader. The didactic and conduct nature of Pamela will be compared to Sarah Fielding's The Governess, the first novel written for girls both to entertain and instruct, making it especially useful as a guide for analyzing its parallel ideology in the child's conduct to Pamela, a romance novel written only a few years apart. The next section of my paper after the introduction is titled A Brief Discussion of Conduct Manuals, where I introduce a handbook on good manners for children by Erasmus of Rotterdam from the 16th century. The introduction to Erasmus explains conduct manuals chart shifting attitudes of society. Further, it says, as new concepts of social interaction make demands on traditional decorum, are behavioral values again being redefined as they were 500 years ago? This explains the usefulness of Erasmus as a preliminary component for this discussion. Through Erasmus, scholars are given the first form of a conduct manual for social manners and its goals therein, but it also unveils the transformation of a genre. Rather, the collapse of several genres, a blurring of lines ushered in by the 18th century. The ideas of conducting young children to virtue is transformed in the 18th century, yet their constructions were inherited and modified from an earlier period, as all social movements work. The next section of my paper is titled A Historical Perspective of the Child. This section relies mainly on Jackie C. Horn's book titled History and the Construction of the Child in Early British Children's Literature. This paper cross-analyzes Pamela as a child, but it also acknowledges that her female gender is essential to the plot and ideologies forwarded in the novel. One reason for this new shift where individual readers feel they have the individual authority to assess virtuousness is because by the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, the measure of one's virtue shifted from bloodlines and family as well as social rank to a person's actual personhood, who they are, instead of what they are. Pamela situates herself as a character who bridges the highly contrasted views of the child. This contrast in characterizing children led to modifying the child protagonist of the novel and therefore also changed the novel as well as reflects shifting social values. The third section of my paper is titled Gender and Class Lenses. The didactic analysis that follows essentially requires a reading which prioritizes reading the text through gender and social class lenses. As women evolved, becoming the compass of virtue for the household and therefore society, this led to an obvious blurring of the virtuous and ideal woman for young women to aspire, but it also, for young girls to aspire, but it also, in changing women's roles, began to change how women were perceived. These changes further beckon to the social fluidity which the scholars used in this paper argue usher in the literary changes, the changes of the novel, and the conduct manual. To conclude this discussion of gender and class issues overlaying the text, it is important to see the ways that Pamela satisfies both of these social anxieties surrounding class and gender. Through her gender, she reforms Mr. B, and by submitting to her class, she is, in an ironic way, able to marry Mr. B. It is Pamela's internal value, though, made evident through the epistolary form which makes her character one to emulate. Pamela's ability to self-correct, where she appears to wander from the master's values, represents an idealized internalization of those values on the part of the servant. This irony is actually the height of this paper's argument. The audience, like Pamela, is adjusting to a changing social master value, and now must evaluate themselves next to this standard. From here, my paper takes a point-by-point analysis pairing the governess and Pamela together and going through specific points, which I'll tell you what they are. The first section is summaries. The second section is looking into the materiality of the books and the ways that they present themselves as conduct manuals there. The next section is organization, and then it goes into the characteristics. Social hierarchy conduct, inner virtue, moderation and submission, obedience is a virtue, female mildness, the skeptical reader, and this gets into the meta-narrative qualities of the texts, and then it goes into novel conclusions. And then the last two sections, or several sections, are titled, this one, Points of Contrast. Thus far, this point-by-point textual comparison has highlighted the similar conduct nature to the 18th century ideologies for young girls. This paper also argues that society is changing, and therefore the novel is changing because the concept of value is changing. An interesting point of contrast between these two novels and the behavioral suggestions they pushed upon young 18th century women is the female role in relation to their husband. In Pamela moralizes Mr. B. However, in The Governess, Mr. Teacham moralizes Mrs. Teacham. What this reveals is Pamela is to be read as a child character who grows into a wife. It also clearly dictates the gender and class expectations in terms of obedience, submission, and moderation, as well as female mildness, as well as poses an argument about the changing role of the moralizer, which the beginning of this paper discusses. It further creates a space to ask the question about audience. Are these hierarchical relationships presented differently because they are written for different audiences, the child versus the adult reader? Then there's a small paragraph that discusses concerns of believability in novels of the 18th century. And then the next section, why is the Pamela debate important? The fact that the audience was so divided that the response is even coined, the Pamela debate, provides social evidence and makes suggestions of the current 21st century climate, an evolution from Erasmus's first 16th century children's guide to manners detailing exact behaviors. Pamela's audience remains divided. Is she virtuous or not? The division is important specifically when treating Pamela as a conduct manual with the intent to imitate, because her character's chief critique lies in her believability. Readers find her character either believably attainable or unbelievably virtuous. In other words, Pamela is praised or critiqued based on whether or not the reader believes they can achieve Pamela's virtue or not, if they can align themselves with her conduct or not. In other words, this means the genre of novel makes believability a concern for Pamela's character, while the didactic nature of a novel specifically aimed at children is not held to the same believability standard. Mrs. Teacham is equally unbelievable, as is Jenny, yet there is not a debate circulating that novel to nearly the same degree as there is surrounding Pamela. This suggests that when adults write for adults, the characters must be believable and relatable. However, when writing for children, the goal was to indoctrinate, even if unbelievable, unrelatable, or unattainable. Then I reach my conclusion, where I state McKeon importantly discusses that virtue is difficult to identify because it lies within the realm of ideology, discourse whose purpose is to mediate and explain apparently intractable social problems, in this case the problematic questions of virtue. Yet the textual analysis provided here shows very clear threads which permeate novels with young female protagonists. This does not mean that the audience just peacefully agreed on the values to indoctrinate the child reader into appropriate social conduct. These causal implications are interesting in considering what impact the novel could could have, because, whatever their differences, progressive plots have in common the aim to explain the meaning of the current crises of status inconsistency, and in the symbolic realm of fictional action to overcome it. In this light, the plot becomes the means of meaning-making in times of inconsistency. This is revolutionary in arguing that these texts are conduct manuals seeking to direct the readers to appropriate behaviors, yet is met with the challenge of changing ideology of virtue because readers moralize the text differently, especially more drastically when the texts are read by different audiences.